Hello, I'm Fred Passman. I'm your host this evening and welcome you to the 18 January 2024 edition of Continental Commandery's Maritime History Virtual Lecture Series. Our series was launched back in May 2020 after the COVID pandemic shutdown created all sorts of opportunities for virtual programming. And we jumped on board with the first lecture was hosted by my predecessor as commander of the Continental Commandery, Captain Aaron Bresnahan, United States Navy, retired. I spent the next 2 years as Continental Commander's Commandery Commander, and I'm currently the Commander General-elect of the Naval Order of the United States. Our first interviewer was with Dr. David Ferrerio, 10th Archivist of the United States Navy. He is also a Navy Vietnam vet. Since then, we've had more than 30 presentations, all of which you can find at the Commandery's past presentations webpage or on our YouTube channel, both of which you can access through the website shown below. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I just want to say a few words about the Naval Order of the United States for our guests who are not already Naval Order companions. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and celebrate United States maritime history and to develop camaraderie amongst those who share a love of learning about our maritime history. If you've served in any of our maritime services, which from the initial Naval Order March, you could see includes United States Marine Corps, United States Navy, United States Coast Guard, Public Health Service Corps, Officer Corps, and the NOAA Officer Corps, as well as the Merchant Marine. Visit the Naval Order website and select Learn About Membership. You can get all the information you need from there. Tonight's presentation is being recorded on YouTube and will be available for viewing immediately after the program is ended. The same link you used to watch the program live is the link you used to watch the program at your leisure again and again. During the program, while it's live, you'll be able to post questions to the comments box. After Mr. Dyer has completed his presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. And at that time, any questions that you have asked through the chat, I will pose to him. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's presenter, Mr. Michael P. Dyer. Mr. Dyer was recently appointed the curator of the the curator of maritime history at the Mystic Seaport Museum in Connecticut. The library you see behind him wasn't there when we first visited earlier this week. He's that new to this position. Before arriving at Mystic Seaport Museum and starting his new position this week, he worked in the field of maritime history, particularly at other maritime museums, since 1992. Most recently, he was the curator of maritime history at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. He's also worked at the Kendall Whaling Museum in Sharon, Massachusetts, and has created several exhibitions, written numerous articles and book chapters, as well as 3 books of his own. His latest is All Hands, Yankee Whaling in the U.S. Navy. So, Michael, welcome aboard. It's great to have you this evening. I'm delighted you were willing and able to take time just as you're learning the ropes in your new office, decorating it as we speak. Welcome to Continental Commander's virtual lecture series.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks for the invitation. It's nice to be here and to talk about maritime history.
So, as I see from your bibliography, your passions seem to have, at least initially, focused on our illustrious whaling history. What caught your imagination when it came to wanting to research the history of Yankee whaling?
Well, what really got me fired up about the whole thing was I went to school for 24 years and I never learned anything about American maritime history. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And, it's a really important, really important topic with that impinges on a great deal of the American experience, both, in the colonial era and even earlier than that, right up to today. Right up to this very day, with the events that are going on, like say off Yemen, for instance. The maritime affairs are a very important part of world affairs, and a very important part of American history. And I just was really, really interested in it, and I didn't, I took it upon myself to sort of educate myself about this. And along the way, I came to Mystic Seaport, was an intern here, studied at the Munson Institute of Maritime Studies, which is a fabulous program. Really have come to enjoy the stuff, the maritime stuff, and engaging with the public. It really is pretty fascinating. So that's the story.
So, as the museum's curator, do you get much opportunity to have direct public interaction? Do you give lectures, tours, or is most of your work with the museum staff?
Oh no, museum curators are not strictly behind the scenes folk. I mean, if you create an exhibition, you're the mind, and so you train docents to talk about it, but you give tours, you engage donors, you engage the public yourself. You give public presentations like this one, for instance. You write. There's a catalog from the All Hands exhibit, which is currently up at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. This catalog is available for $20, I think, from the Whaling Museum. And so, there's a great deal of education, an educational component to what we do. Of course, there is, and it adds value to the visitor's experience, for certain. That it's not just some abstract thing that was created out of the ether and appears on the walls. People have ideas, and especially in history museums, ideas come over time, and really good exhibits come out of the experience, of people that working with these collections for some time.
Excellent. Well, speaking of that passion, I want to turn over the deck of the con to you, and I'm looking forward to listening to your presentation along with the other members of the audience. So take it away. You've got the deck of the con.
Great. Well, super. Thank you all for coming. The idea, it's interesting working with museum collections because sometimes the collections themselves will lead you in certain kinds of directions. Over the years, every story that I'm going to cover in this presentation has been covered individually, but at no point that has any curator or historian said, "Wait a minute, there's a consistent narrative here." The whaling and the Navy had an awful lot to do with each other from the very, very beginning. And so, right here in this, this opening slide, I chose the all hands Yankee whaling in the U.S. Navy. You see that there's the emblem of the United States Hydrographic Office, which is printed right on a chart that Matthew Fontaine Maury, who was the Lieutenant Maury, was in charge of the Hydrographic Office in the 1850s, and he was a pioneer in oceanography. And one of the ways that he did that was what today we would call sort of cloud sourcing. But then he distributed physical logbooks to merchant mariners, whalers, any naval vessels, and had them compile data. And then he would take those logbooks and he would sift all that data, and with it he was able to predict the winds and currents and other weather phenomenon that would affect a sailing voyage. And whalers were a big part of that, part of the program itself. He also was able to identify the environments where certain species of whales lived by gleaning that information from whaling logbooks. So, whalers and the Navy together developed some of the foundations of modern oceanography. The little sperm whale tooth on the other side, that's just just this great heroic thing. There's the Yankee tar, there he is. He's the Yankee sailor, and there's the 24-pound cannon behind him and the stack of cannonballs and the American flag, and it's engraved on a sperm whale tooth. So this is actual whaleman's scrimshaw, and the point of the scrimshaw is that there's some kind of a notion of real pride and patriotism in the sea services. So that notion of the integration and pollination of these two sea services, I think, was really engaging to me, and was the foundation for creating this exhibition. Some of the earliest history as far as this goes is that in right around the time of the very beginning of the American Revolution in 1775, there was a naval engagement in Buzzards Bay. What happened was the British in Boston, needed supplies as the war began. They needed supplies of various kinds, foodstuffs, armament, all kinds of materials, and they started raiding the colonists to get this stuff. And the HMS Falcon, under John Lindsay, master, in May of 1775, sailed into Buzzards Bay and captured a couple of coastal vessels that had cargoes of value to him. And the colonists got very upset about that, and they armed a whaling sloop. So this in the PowerPoint, you see that there's a engraving there of this topsail sloop, and it is one of the best depictions of a colonial sloop in my experience. It's just a fabulous thing. And it was the whaling sloop's success, and these colonists armed this thing, and they sailed out into Buzzards Bay, and they retook the two vessels, and they captured a bunch of British. And this was shortly after Lexington and Concord, and it was certainly the first naval engagement of the American Revolution. And so it's naval with a small n. So this was not the U.S. Navy. but it was nonetheless a naval engagement with a small n. And it sort of took place. It did take place in Buzzards Bay off the tip of what was then called Fort Point. After the Revolution, there was an actual fort built there, Fort Phoenix. There was an earthworks there during the Revolution, and it was armed with cannon that were actually seized by Captain Esek Hopkins in the first U.S. Navy, Continental Navy expedition to the Bahamas. Esek Hopkins ransacked Nassau and captured a bunch of cannon and gunpowder and other ammunition, and brought it back. And a couple of those cannon were installed at the fort there, which later became Fort Phoenix, and sits right at the mouth of the harbor there, with New Bedford on one side and Fairhaven on the other. At that time, Bedford Village was a pretty small place, and it was nowhere near as significant as it would become as an industrial whaling port. But what it was a fabulous anchorage and a haven for privateers, and as well as having warehouses and a rope works and spermaceti manufacturers. But it was a pretty small place at that time. And then later on in the war, of course, it would be ransacked and burned by a British Expeditionary Force in 1778. So the lack of an actual Navy presence, at that time in 1778, didn't help New Bedford or Bedford Village or Fairhaven sort of at all. But the fort figured significantly, and the cannon that were in it were actually captured by Captain Esek Hopkins in the first Navy expedition to the Bahamas, which is pretty interesting. And there he is. Well, it might be him. This is another scrimshaw tooth engraved with a American naval officer, and it's as near as I can tell from researching into a variety of uniforms and a variety of images of the period. It could be either Esek Hopkins or John Paul Jones, and I think it's a combination of Esek Hopkins and John Paul Jones. So whatever it is, it's a Continental Navy officer engraved on a sperm whale tooth. An engraving of this sort would not have been particularly early. So this would have been sometime in the I would put this in the early to mid 1840s. So maritime memories are long. I love this print. This is this William Birch and Son print, the title of which is Preparation for War to Defend Commerce. And this print holds pride of place in the opening label of the exhibit, because it implies something very, very important to the U.S. Navy naval experience. This was the building of the frigate Philadelphia, which, like the frigate Essex, was built by subscription by the members of the community. So the Essex was built in Salem, and the Philadelphia was built in Philadelphia, but it was built by the people of the community, not by Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam built 6 frigates, but these were not among them. However, the idea that commerce is what the Navy is there to defend, that our freedom is not necessarily an idea of personal freedom. It's an idea of freedom to trade, as is to engage in business freely on the high seas, and that is a very interesting notion to me. That for many, many years, the U.S. Navy's own sole function was really to enable commerce, American commerce, to proceed on the high seas. That's interesting. It wasn't. It was not engaged in any kind of an imperial action. the way some of the other navies of the world, the British, the French, the Spanish, certainly, the American Navy, the U.S. Navy wouldn't really assume that kind of a profile until the war with Mexico in the 1840s. But up to that time, the Navy was really did serve the business community, which is kind of funny to think about, kind of interesting. So, diving right into this, this guy, George Claghorn, he served in the American Revolution. He was at the Battle of Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill, but he was a shipbuilder from New Bedford, Bedford Village at that time, and he Henry Knox hired him to manage the shipyard, Hart's Yard in Charlestown for the building of the USS Constitution. And there's a little plaque down on the New Bedford waterfront there. It says, near this site was located the shipyard of Colonel George Claghorn, builder of U.S. frigate Constitution and the ship Rebecca, the first whaler to double Cape Horn. His service in the War of the Revolution covered a period of 5 years as first lieutenant, captain, major. So Claghorn, it's said that Claghorn's pride in his accomplishment sort of overtook his entire personality to the point where he was insufferable when people would cross the street to avoid him. That's sort of the story, is that he became an insufferable bore, talking about his service to the country and the building of the Constitution. You get a sense of that in that little quotation there. The Constitution will become the pride and ornament of the American race. The American race. So that's it. That's curious in and of itself. But these connections. Claghorn built a ship called the Barclay, and we're going to hear about the Barclay here by and by. The Barclay was one of the American whalers, which was on the coast of Peru in the very early part of the 19th century, when the War of 1812 broke out. There were a number of British whalers and British naval vessels in the Pacific as well when the war broke out, and the British Navy was capturing and detaining American whale ships. Captain David Porter of the frigate Essex that we heard about earlier took the war to the Pacific. He rounded Cape Horn in the frigate Essex, and in 1813, and he himself in the Essex began capturing British whalers and incarcerating their crews and retaking the American whalers and setting those guys free. The master of the Barclay, and we'll hear about him too by and by. His name was Gideon Randall, and there's a whole story about the Randalls that's coming up later in the program. But this was a very specific effort on the part of Porter to take a powerful U.S. Navy frigate into the Pacific Ocean to protect the whaling fleet. That quote there, and now I shall notice the important services rendered by our coming into the Pacific. We had effectually prevented them from, from doing any injury to our own whale ships, only 2 of which have been captured, and their captures took place before our arrival. Ultimately, what happened was Porter got boxed in Valparaiso, and the HMS Phoebe and HMS Cherub just bombed the Essex into total submission. The mission was a success in some ways and a failure in others. But nonetheless, it was an important effort on the part of the Navy in support of the whale fishery. In 1825, there was another such effort, and this is another of these stories. The Pacific was a wide open, was viewed as being a sort of wide open frontier, where in the imagination it was completely exotic and ungoverned, and just there for exploitation. And one of these whalemen, his name was Samuel Comstock. He was a Nantucket guy, young guy. He went on a whaling voyage, and he came back. When he came back, he was a changed man. He wasn't the same man that left. It said that his complexion was burned very brown from the sun, and there was something wrong in his mind. But on that voyage, he conceived this notion that he could seize a whale ship. He could sail to the Pacific on a whaler, seize the ship, sail it to some exotic island locale, and become king of the island. Like he would establish his own kingdom in the Pacific. This guy Comstock. So he was pretty much crazy as a loon. This guy. But he did this. And the ship Globe of Nantucket sailed to the Pacific Ocean. And while they were in the Pacific Ocean, Comstock and a couple of other guys rose up, and they killed the master and they killed the officers. And not all the crew were mutineers. Some of the crew had nothing to do with the mutiny, but they sailed the ship to the Mealy Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, and Comstock and his pals went ashore to establish their kingdom. And of course, the natives would have none of this. The whole thing just ended in complete disaster on shore. Comstock was killed. A couple of the other guys that were with him, who were not mutineers, sort of ran off into the bush and hid for a while. Other members were killed by the natives, and the crew got sail on the ship and sailed it back to Peru. At this time, there was the very earliest iteration of the Pacific Squadron, which was a frigate and a couple of small vessels, including the topsail schooner Dolphin. And when word got back to Washington, at the urging of the business community in Nantucket and New Bedford and elsewhere, they said, look, you guys got to do something about this. You've got a Navy squadron out there in the Pacific. Our guys are suffering from mutineers and heaven only knows what. You've got to go out and do something about this. And so Black Jack Percival, just commanded the U.S. schooner Dolphin, and sure enough, they sailed off into the Pacific in 1827. I'm sorry, to see if they could round up the mutineers of the Globe. And they ended up rescuing a couple of guys, Cyrus Lay and William Hussey. But this was, in fact, the first U.S. naval police action in the Pacific, was to round up the mutineers of the ship Globe. And they did the whole voyage. If you haven't read the Journal of a Cruise of the schooner Dolphin, it's a pretty exciting narrative, especially when they got to Hawaii, because the guys wanted women badly, and the missionaries in Hawaii didn't want the whalemen to have women at all, and so it created this whole dynamic of mistrust and unpleasantness in Hawaii that was actually brought on by these sailors on the schooner Dolphin, exacerbated by the religious proclivities, moral proclivities of the missionaries. So you can see that the Pacific was a changing place, really changing a lot, and this narrative really sort of the whole story of the mutiny on the Globe and Percival and the schooner Dolphin sort of is a excellent introduction into the really radical changes that were coming for the islands in the Pacific and the Pacific Islanders themselves. This is just another really interesting example. There was a whaler, Alexander Cornell, sailed on the Barclay of Westport, and while they were in the Atlantic, he went on board the the U.S. brig Porpoise, which was anchored at Cape Verde, and he went on board and he drew that pencil sketch in the lower right of the crew of the Porpoise working at the capstan. You could see the guns in the background, and you could see that there's a drummer and a fife player in the sort of top right part of just above where the guys are working on around the capstan. There was no shantying in the Navy, so he actually talks about how quiet the men were. The men were Navy sailors were not allowed to sing at their work, so they had to work to the fife and drum, and he made note of that. This whole idea of shantying was something that was done on merchant vessels, not done in the Navy. But still, Cornell nonetheless drew, a Navy tar very similar to the Navy tar that we saw on that first tooth, that first piece of scrimshaw. There he is with his flag and his cannon and his fouled anchor, and he's the representative American mariner out there in the world. The U.S. brig Porpoise, of course, would later take part in the U.S. exploring expedition, and I'm not really covering the U.S. exploring expedition that much in this talk, but I will say this: that the whaling fleet was so engaged in the Pacific that advocates for that business and that navigation went before Congress and strongly demanded that the United States mount an exploratory expedition of the Pacific, specifically to chart islands and to sort of engage in peacekeeping or gunboat diplomacy for the natives of the islands of the Pacific and elsewhere, and to chart the coast of California in particular. That was a very dangerous coast and becoming more and more valuable. And so the U.S. exploring expedition was 1836 through 1840, and under Commander Wilkes, Charles Wilkes was the commander on the sloop of war Vincennes, and just by and by, this is just an interesting fact that expedition collected enormous collections of all sorts of objects from cultures all around the Pacific area, plant specimens, animal skins. It was a full-blown voyage of exploration. Those collections came back and formed the founding collection of the U.S. National Museum, the Smithsonian Institution. So the foundation collections of the U.S. National Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, were collected by the Navy on an expedition to document the Pacific Ocean for the benefit of the merchant fleet, especially the whaling fleet. So that's kind of neat. It's kind of cool. This is a big story. There's a lot to it. Now here we go with the Randall family. And we met Gideon Randall, who was Captain George Randall's dad, who was a whaling master. And he was commanding the Barclay in the Pacific during the War of 1812. George Randall himself was a whaling master, and eventually he became a merchant, and he owned whale ships, very successful. He himself, he passed away. He died in 1849. He was on a voyage to San Francisco himself with a ship with a cargo of goods and supplies to sell in San Francisco, and the vessel was lost and he drowned at sea, leaving Martha a widow. But their son, one of their sons, but this son in particular, William Pritchard Randall, born in New Bedford, educated in New Bedford and Phillips Andover Academy. He learned navigation. He went immediately after his education. He went into the whale fishery, and he worked his way up through 3 voyages. He was about to be appointed master on his 4th voyage, master of a whaler, when the Civil War broke out, and he joined the Navy. And he served on board the USS Cumberland in the Battle of Hampton Roads. And that very famous, that whole famous battle of the battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the North called it the Merrimack. The southern states actually named the vessel the CSS Virginia. But Randall was, the guy on the Cumberland who stuck to his gun and was, firing his, he continued to fire his cannon as the Cumberland was sinking. And he was one of these real, bona fide heroes. This guy, his ex-whaleman, came up through the New Bedford whaling family, joins the Navy, is engaged in this battle. And he grew to a ripe old age. There he is on the left, Commander William P. Randall, in his uniform, in all hands, if you should get yourself a copy, Gordon Calhoun, who's a curator at the Naval History and Heritage Command, wrote the chapter on William Pritchard Randall in this book, and it's a pretty great story. So there's that's another little chapter. James Fenimore Cooper. I mean, who knew that James Fenimore Cooper, as a young man, was a midshipman in the U.S. Navy? After the War of 1812, he bought a whaler. he bought a whaler, the ship Union of Sag Harbor, for 2 right whaling voyages, and of course he went on to become a great novelist, and a historian as well. He wrote the history of the Navy of the United States himself. But in his famous book, The Pilot, the hero of The Pilot, Long Tom Coffin, was supposed to have been this Nantucket whaler. It was actually based on the character Reuben Chase, who was a sailor who sailed in the Continental Navy with John Paul Jones, but who would later, after the Revolution, become a whale ship owner in Nantucket. He bought whalers. This figure of this guy, Long Tom Coffin, was based on, Cooper based him on Reuben Chase. And while, Chase wasn't a whaleman at the time, he became one later. So that's kind of interesting. And then, of course, there's the poster child for American maritime experience, Herman Melville himself, who sailed on merchant voyages, sailed on a whaling voyage to the Pacific on the ship Acushnet of Fairhaven, deserts in the Marquesas Islands, knocks around the Pacific on a number of voyages, winds up in Hawaii, and in order to get home, he joined the frigate United States. And so he writes Moby Dick, but he also writes, which is a rattling good book, White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War. And he, like Richard Henry Dana, and J. Ross Brown, Herman Melville, really does focus on the very poor treatment that sailors before the mast received at the hands of the establishment, be it the captain and officers on board these vessels, merchant vessels, whale ships, Navy vessels. It was a hierarchy, and they all 3 were categorically opposed to flogging, and all 3 of them, J. Ross Brown, Richard Henry Dana, and Herman Melville, addressed this really atrocious disciplinary action of flogging sailors. But in the course of the research, and this sort of, it's just in the research. It's not in the exhibit because it wasn't very exhibitable. But the fact is that there are a lot of sailors from the whaling fleet who would desert their ship somewhere and join in the Navy. They'd sail around in the Navy for a while because the food was generally better, and they got regular pay. And then they would desert again, and maybe they would join on another whaler for a while and get out of wherever they were to get to someplace else, and then they'd join the Navy and go back to the United States. And so this was a relatively common occurrence out there in the world in the 19th century. And here's a great piece. This is a sperm whale tooth that's engraved, reverse engraved as a stamp. It was engraved by a man named Ferdinand Piper of the U.S. Navy. Ferdinand Piper served on the USS Schooner Dolphin in the Pacific Squadron, not on the voyage with Blackjack Percival, but later. And it was probably there, if I had to guess, it was probably in the Pacific where he engaged in this. Where he made this piece of scrimshaw. It's Navy scrimshaw, which is not common at all. Piper came to a very sad end in the Gulf of Mexico. He was serving on a ship in the Gulf of Mexico and lightering crew ashore in a small craft. And a white squall came up and overturned the craft, and Ferdinand Piper was drowned. It's a great piece, and I mean, another of these cultural icons, examples of material culture that so strongly underscore the relationship. Here's a beautiful portrait of the USS Independence. And this was drawn by a guy named Lebbeus Stockbridge Jr., who served on the whale ship Magnolia, and the USS Independence was on the coast of California during the war with Mexico, and Lebbeus Stockbridge and his shipmates on the Magnolia and on the ship Edward of New Bedford volunteered during the it was the Battle of San Jose de Cabo, and Stockbridge writes in his journal, a party of 26 men from each ship, the Edward and our own, went to town, all armed, some with lances and spades and others with muskets, and exercised with the Marines there. The commanding officer complimented them on their fine appearance and told them he would be happy to have such a force to call on in case he needed assistance. In the very beginning of the forming of the Navy, one of the strongest advocates for it said that the whale fishery was a nursery for seamen, and this would have been, among the various our founding fathers. John Adams, for one, reiterated over and over again that these merchant sailors and whalemen were vital for the national interest, for the building of a navy, and they were prophetic. I mean, they were right. It actually, it happened. Another fabulous story, a great story. This is the story of Joaquim Pease. Joaquim Pease was a Cape Verdean immigrant to New Bedford in the 1850s. He winds up in New Bedford from the Cape Verde Islands, and he joins a whale ship, and he sails on a whaling voyage, and the whaling voyage comes back, and the war breaks out, and he joins the U.S. Navy, and he serves on board the USS Kearsarge during the battle off Cherbourg, where the Raphael Semmes and the CSS Alabama were destroyed, were sunk, and Joaquim Pease for valor earned a Medal of Honor for valor in that battle, and he never received his medal, but there it is. It's on loan. It's at the museum. You can go see it. It was on loan from the Naval History and Heritage Command. They very graciously loaned us the Medal of Joaquim Pease Medal of Honor. And it's just a a great story that seems to, these stories come in one after another, which really does lead me to believe that there's a strong thematic element to this history. Here's the story of the Stone Fleet, which sailed from New Bedford in 1861. There were two stone fleets, and these were old, decrepit whalers that the U.S. Navy bought them from whaling agents, and they filled them up with rocks, and they sailed them down to Charleston and Savannah and sank them in the harbors to try to block the harbor from any kind of rebel shipping. And the whole effort failed miserably, but that's beside the point. It's the thought that counts. The Navy bought these whalers and used them in, try to blockade, use them in the war effort. There's a flag in the collection. It's on exhibit. It was captured. It was captured by the USS Memphis off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, in 1863. There were a whole slew of New Bedford whaling guys who were served in the Navy and served on board the vessels that were involved, served on board the USS Memphis. A very interesting thing, in tracing the provenance of this piece in the museum, was that it was donated by a guy named Oliver Brown, and so I'm looking into Oliver Brown. And Oliver Brown was a dealer in carpeting and ceramics in New Bedford in the 1890s and in the early 20th century. And I was like, well, what does Oliver Brown have to do with, why would he donate this? So I'm looking into it a little further, and here his father was a whaling agent. And get this, his name was Oliver Hazard Perry Brown. so his parents named him after a naval hero. He goes into the whaling trade, and somewhere along the line, he wound up with this trophy of the Civil War, and his son donates it to the Whaling Museum in New Bedford. Last but not least, of course, is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, the Delano part is the important part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's whaling story. His forebears were whale ship owners and whaling masters out of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and he of course was Assistant Secretary of the Navy and spearheaded this project during World War I, where there was far more shipping than there was navigating instruments to serve the fleet. And so Uncle Sam requested merchant mariners to loan their navigating instruments to the Navy. And the Navy took these navigating instruments and calibrated them and engraved calibration and USN numbers on the pieces. And there were two pieces. There were two spyglasses and this sextant, which were in the Whaling Museum collection. One of the spyglasses was owned by Mercator Cooper himself, the famous Sag Harbor whaling master, and the other was a Captain Gifford of New Bedford. So there's a whole lot more to talk about, but that's all I'm going to talk about this evening. And I'll be happy to answer any questions or chat with anybody about this fascinating subject.
I could listen to you for another hour. It's all, to me, very fascinating stuff. Of course, I confess I cut my teeth on Moby Dick and on 2 Years Before the Mast and any number of other sea tales. My initial training includes, my PhD includes an oceanographic component. And so I'd actually left active duty to spend more time at sea. And then funding for oceanographic research got cut. Couple of questions. One of the comment from Bob Thompson is he noticed that the initial efforts of the United States Navy focused on the freedom of seas for, of course, American tradesmen, and how today the mission is similar, but now it's gone international, where we're trying to protect freedom of seas for the world's democracies. And I think that just echoes the point you made several times during your presentation, that there's a continuum. And these, we hear about single episodes, but you string the episodes together. That's that story of the evolution of both our merchant marine and our Navy. I believe you answered a question that came to my mind early on. As I was listening, I began to wonder, well, did the sailors tend to go back and forth between naval service and civilian service, merchant marine or whaling fleet? Now, you were focusing on primarily the whaling fleet, but I have to guess that if you were an able seaman aboard a whaler, you might then become an able seaman aboard a merchant trade ship carrying cargo from Point Alpha to Point Bravo, or maybe even around the world, much of the world, and then come back and do some time in the Navy. Is that how the first half of the 19th century, was this something just sailors did, or were the officers also likely to become masters of private ships and then masters of Navy ships?
There were plenty of whaling masters who became who went to war, but then they didn't stay. Few stayed in the Navy after that. And chatting with colleagues, over the years, Mary Kay Burkall Edwards, for instance, we were talking about this, and in Moby Dick, you remember that scene on the Pequod where Captain Bildad is berating Ishmael for being a merchant sailor. It's like, I don't want anything to do with merchant sailors. And so they sort of look down their nose at merchant sailors, but in White Jacket, the whalemen on the Navy ship were the bottom of the barrel. The Navy guys were like, they just look down on blubber hunters, and so there is pride that runs through these services, but there's also a great deal of swapping around of sailors, for sure. I think that's just the nature of seafaring. It's the nature of seafaring. Everybody gets involved for a while, and people, in a whaler, there's Cape Verdeans, and there's Azorians, and there's Spaniards, and there are Brits, and there's Norwegians, and there's runaway enslaved people, and there's dyed-in-the-wool Yankees who are trained in seafaring and navigation, and there's these bumpkins from upstate New York who are, just want to stop looking at the backside of a mule and go see the world. And so it's this polyglot population that just populates seafaring. Conrad was great in that. He just covers all of the different kinds of people that one encounters. At sea. It's just the way it is.
On a totally different topic, again, I've spent better part of 10 years up in your neck of the woods, and so I know Buzzards Bay, I know Martha's Vineyard. There was, of course, no Cape Cod Canal back in that era, but I've gone through it any number of times on both research vessels and mine sweeps. But for the folks watching the presentation who've never been in the Massachusetts area, you want to give us a quick kind of like orient our geography?
I'm sorry.
Any slides on that, I know, but
I'm sorry. Say that again, please.
Orient the geography, or maybe I can do a quick present and flash just relative to Boston. Where is Buzzards Bay?
Well,
Cape Cod. A lot of people don't even know where Cape Cod is.
It's the southeast coast of Massachusetts. So, the region abuts Narragansett. So Buzzards Bay runs out, and Narragansett Bay begins, and then on the east side of Buzzards Bay are the Elizabeth Islands, Martha's Vineyard, and then further out Nantucket. Just due north of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket is Cape Cod itself. So Cape Cod forms the sort of northeast border of Buzzards Bay. And on the west border of Buzzards Bay is the town of Wareham, Marion, important shipbuilding port of Mattapoisett, Fairhaven, New Bedford. Further south is Dartmouth, Westport. And then going around Westport, you get around toward Newport, and then you go up north from Newport, and you're heading into Providence. So,
Right.
Okay. Geographically, I can tell you this: it's still easier to sail from Fairhaven to Newport than it is to drive there. It's a pain,
especially with the construction that's going on around Providence. So if folks take a look at Providence and Boston on Google Maps, you'll see Cape Ann as the body of water north of Cape Cod, and then Buzzards Bay and Vineyard Sound are kind of like close to I'll call it the mainland. I'll say the armpit of the Cape. So as that Cape hooks out, and interestingly, if you go from the tip of Cape Cod to the Springfield, the geographic center of Massachusetts is just a little bit west of the bay. You would think, you look at the landmass and you focus on, you think you're going almost out to Springfield before you get to the middle of the state. But the distance that Cape Cod extends eastward is really quite substantial. And I think one of the reasons why it was always such a great whaling area is the continental shelf goes out about 100 miles. It's fairly shallow water, so you get a lot of upwelling. You get the meeting of the Labrador Current with the Gulf Stream, and just tremendously nutrient rich. If you dive in that area, on a good day, you'll get 10 feet of visibility because there's so much plankton that obscures the visibility. But I think that has a lot to do with the story. And it's interesting that despite the richness of the North Atlantic, people prefer to go around Cape Horn and whale in the Pacific and go after those Pacific Island opportunities.
A fact is that the sperm whale population in the North Atlantic was a consistent throughout the entire history of Yankee whaling. From the 18th century right up to the very end, sperm whale fishery in the North Atlantic was a going concern. And they were producing very large animals still coming out of the North Atlantic in the 19 teens.
Right.
And the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, as the fleets got bigger, and we just went further afield looking for whales. And they went everywhere. They went all along, the coasts of South America and in Africa and the Indian Ocean. This is why Matthew Fontaine Maury's work is so fascinating, because it defines what whalemen were seeing and what they were experiencing and what they were doing and where they were hunting and why they were hunting there.
Right.
He took the data and he created a way of understanding it. which is extremely beneficial. Today, I mean, historically, it's beneficial. It was beneficial at the time because you could predict where the whales were.
We've got 15 seconds left. We'll pick up after we go offline. But again, I'm going to thank you for a fantastic, fascinating presentation. I want to invite everybody to join us again on February 22nd, same time, 1900 Eastern Standard Time is when we broadcast, where Captain Valerie Orman will talk about the fairly short but impressive history of women in the naval aviation, flying fighter jets over the past 20 years. Title, Women on Aircraft Carriers, has it already been 20 years? So we look forward to seeing everybody then. And again, thank you, Mike, for a superb presentation.
You're welcome. It was fun.